Hello and welcome to Book Breaks. We are so thrilled to welcome you here today as we discuss the book Puerto Rico, A National History. And we'd like to thank Citizens Travelers, the nonpartisan civic engagement initiative, the Travelers Companies for the continued support of Book Breaks. And we'd also like to thank viewers like you. And I'm your host, Gina Oppenheim, and I'm joined as always by my pal, Ryan. Hey, Ryan. And he'll be asking your questions in the second half of the program. And without further ado, we are so thrilled today to welcome the author, Dr. Melendez-Badillo, who's Assistant Professor of Latin American and Caribbean History at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Go Badgers. He is the author of The Lettered Workers, Archival Power, and the Politics of Knowledge in Puerto Rico. Welcome, Professor. We're so thrilled to have you here today.
Thank you. I'm excited to be here.
Now, just to start us off, can you give us an overview of Puerto Rico and national history?
So Puerto Rico and National History is a book that seeks to document the broad history of Puerto Rico from pre-Columbian times to Bad Bunny. So the book actually ends with the global rap superstar Bad Bunny. And so in that swath of time, more than 500 years, what I try to do is document the ways that although Puerto Rico is a non-sovereign nation, Puerto Ricans have crafted a complex idea of the nation, of what it means to belong to Puerto Rico rather than Spain or the United States. And they've done so throughout its history. And so the book documents those debates. And ultimately, what I argue is that Puerto Ricans have crafted an idea of the nation that is fluid, it's diasporic, and legally ambiguous.
Yeah, and you open the book with the story of your grandfather. How did he inspire this work?
Yes, absolutely. So, part of the reason why I wrote this book is because this is the book that I wanted to read as a high school student, the book that I wanted to read in college. I learned the first history lessons from my grandparents, people that made it to fourth and sixth grade, respectively. And so I wanted to document the histories of people like them in a national history of Puerto Rico. So for me, it was very important to begin the book not with statesmen, not with the people that we're so used to knowing in Puerto Rican history, but those anonymous individuals like my grandparents, people that lived through the processes that I document in the book. And so the book begins with the story of my grandfather as he traveled to the United States and came back, something that I go deeper in the book in the chapter on the Great Migration. But for me, it really showcased and highlighted some of the themes and topics that permeate the book's narrative.
Yeah, and you also write early on that Puerto Rico is the oldest country in the world. Can you tell us about that statement?
Yes, absolutely. So that's the title of a book by a legal scholar, Trias Monge, who argues that Puerto Rico is in fact the oldest colony in the world. But that has been contested. But the reality of it is that Puerto Rico has been a colonial possession since 1493, first of the Spanish Empire from 1493 all the way to 1898. And then from 1898 to the present moment, it is a U.S. territory. I argue in the book that it's a colonial possession because of a series of Supreme Court cases that are known as the insular cases that we can talk more about later on. But yes, ultimately, Puerto Rico is in fact, if not the oldest colony in the world, one of the oldest colonies in the modern world.
Yeah, and can you tell us about its earliest inhabitants?
Yes. So one of the things that I really wanted to do in the book is to think about the role of migration and the ways that people have conceptualized what we call today Puerto Rico in that constant coming and going. And so we begin the book with pre-Columbian societies that arrived in the archipelago known then as Boriquén thousands of years ago, around 4,000 to 6,000 years ago. And they arrived in waves of migration and began creating complex societies. So when the Spanish arrived in Boriquén in 1493 in Columbus' second voyage, they actually find a society that was highly organized politically, socially, economically, religiously. And so while we do not know much because they did not leave behind any written record, what we do know is that they were highly organized and they were also moving from one place to the other. One of the things that I like to tell my students, and I also mention in the book, is that waterways were not borders for them. Waterways were ways of connecting with people from other islands. So you had cacicazgos or chiefdoms that were not only contained in Boriquen, but also took part in what is now the Dominican Republic and Haiti. And so I begin the book with pre-Columbian societies and their patterns of migration, one, to document the agency of these individuals. The book basically begins with an insurrection of indigenous peoples in 1511 of Cacique Agüeybaná II, and also to highlight that we as people have been constantly moving from one place to the other since pre-Columbian times.
Yeah, and who were the first real colonizers there, and how were they received?
Yeah, so it's interesting because one of the things that I wanted to do was to break away from certain myths that were reproduced in the school curriculum, and that's something that still happens today. So the first people that arrived are the Spaniards. And so they arrived in 1493. And although we, as Puerto Ricans, like to think that we're at the center of the universe, in reality, Puerto Rico was an afterthought. So they settled, the Spanish actually settled in La Española, modern day Dominican Republic. And so from there, they began the conquest of the Caribbean and then the Americas as a whole. But Puerto Rico was actually conquered 15 years after the Spanish first arrived in the archipelago. So the conquest of Puerto Rico actually began in 1508 by Juan Ponce de León after a charter that moved from hand to hand. And so eventually he arrives in the island, conquers the island. And although people like to mention that the Taino peoples, the people that actually lived there, were docile, in reality, they resisted the conquest from day one. Agüeybaná II actually resisted with this insurrection, but before his brother Agüeybaná I actually made peace with the colonizers because he understood that they had military weapons, they had more people, and they had things that they had never seen in their life. However, the indigenous peoples resisted the conquest since day one. And the example that I give in the book is that insurrection in 1511 that basically led to the assassination of about 300 to 400 Spaniards at a moment when there were only about 600 to 700 Spaniards in Boriquen. But the people that first conquered Puerto Rico were Spaniards coming out of almost 1,000 years of war against Muslim communities in the Iberian Peninsula. So it's after the Reconquista that they arrived in the Caribbean with those ideas of the Reconquista very fresh in their heads when they start the process of conquering these islands.
Yeah, can you tell us what was the impact of the gold mining industry? Because that was fascinating.
Yeah, so that was the first sort of economic enterprise. So one of the things that really struck the Spaniards when they arrived in the Caribbean was the abundance of gold. And so they saw gold, and gold basically became the first sort of mining enterprise in the Caribbean region writ large. And so they use indigenous peoples as enslaved workers who work in the mining industry. But very quickly, by 1530, it was clear that those deposits of gold were quickly dwindling. And so they started to diversify the economy. That's when we see the arrival of sugar by the 1520s. And also, not only was gold dwindling, but also because of the treatment that the indigenous peoples received, they started dying massively. Some of them committed suicide. Others died because of the germs that the Europeans brought with them. Others fled to the mountains. And that's when we see that the Spanish also begin introducing into the Caribbean enslaved African peoples. And so that's also the origins of the African slave trade in the Caribbean region, which is also another component that I try to highlight in the book, that it begins with gold, then they diversify by the 1520s. Also, it's important that not only are the gold mines dwindling the amount of gold, but also it's the same moment that the Spanish begin the conquest of the Americas. And so the Caribbean, and Puerto Rico included, becomes an afterthought. There's a saying from the era that went, Dios me lleva el Perú, may God take me to Peru. So a lot of people that were in Puerto Rico, that were in Cuba, that were in Santo Domingo, actually wanted to leave these islands and go and try their luck in Peru. That's also a moment when the government tries to keep people in the Caribbean. And so they start doing hard sentences on people that try to leave without the proper permits. And so it's also a moment in which not only is the economy diversifying, but it's also a moment that it's very dire for the local populations, because the Caribbean becomes an afterthought, not only for the colonizers in the region, but also to the Spanish crown in Spain.
Yeah, and you have a lot of notable figures that you mentioned in the book, and one person who stuck out to me was Miguel Enriquez. Can you tell
Yes,
us about him?
absolutely. So he's a fascinating individual. So part of the reason why I mentioned the African slave trade in the Caribbean is because a lot of people were brought in shackles. As we know, slavery and enslavement was one of the most violent systems of oppression in the history of the world. And so the Spanish asked, so there's a census in 1530 known as el Censo de Lando. Lando was the governor that ordered this census. And so by then, it was clear that the amount of indigenous peoples left was really small. Some people argue that there were about 500,000 indigenous peoples before the Spaniards arrived. By this census, there was only a handful. I think it's like 3,000 indigenous peoples that were reported. Now, censuses are really problematic, and we need to also be careful when we think about censuses, but it also tells you that there was a real shortage of indigenous people in the region. And so that's when they start bringing enslaved African people. So one of the things that I want to do in the book is highlight the agency of those people. And so I do so through the figure of Miguel Enriquez, who was someone who came from a family. His mom was formerly enslaved. His father he never met. Eventually, he finds out that it's a priest. And that's why Miguel Enriquez was born free. Also, he received an education, unlike other people, African descent peoples in this society. And this is the late 1600s, early 1700s. Eventually, through his negotiations with the governor at the time, he was arrested for contraband. So this is a moment, one of the things that I mentioned in the book is that when the Spanish crown begins the conquest of the Americas and the Caribbean becomes an afterthought, contraband becomes a lifeline for the people in these islands. So Miguel Enriquez tries his luck in contraband. He gets caught. Once he's arrested, he's in the governor's mansion working. The governor takes a look at him and the ways that he's dealing with his work, and he likes Miguel Enriquez. He becomes an acquaintance of the governor. He starts doing contraband with the governor. The governor, just to sort of to look on his own back, he basically puts a lot of property on Miguel Enriquez's name, all of this property that he bought from contraband, and eventually dies mysteriously, the governor. So overnight, Miguel Enriquez becomes one of the first African descent millionaires, or one of the first millionaires in the Caribbean region. He owns a fleet of ships. He's not only into contraband, but now he became a corsair. Which was basically a pirate with the permit of the crown. So at a moment when the Spanish crown is at war with the French, with the British, he's the one in the Caribbean protecting the Spanish fortifications, protecting Spanish interests. And so Miguel Enriquez is a fascinating individual. He's African descent. He's the first millionaire in the Caribbean. He also receives the highest honor that any Puerto Rican received throughout all of the Spanish colonial times from 1493 to 1898. And all of that to say that he was the most powerful individual, not only in Puerto Rico, but in the Caribbean. However, the elite in Puerto Rico never forgave him for being African descent. So he dies in a cloister, he dies poor, he's buried in an unnamed grave. And so for me, it's a fascinating story of how this African descent man was able to garner all this power in this highly white supremacist colonial structure. And although he was one of the most powerful men, and he paid for the burial of all the most important political figures in Puerto Rico of his times, he's in an unnamed grave. We don't know where his body lays today. But for me, it was important to highlight the story of Miguel Enriquez to talk about those sort of racial hierarchies during the Spanish colonial time.
Yeah, and we have a ton of students and teachers in the audience, and he would be an amazing research project.
Yes,
well.
absolutely. Absolutely. He's someone that I did not learn anything about in school. When I was growing up, I did my elementary, and all my grade school in Puerto Rico, and my BA and my master's. And I never learned about Miguel Enriquez. So he's a fascinating individual that allows us to understand the porosity of history, how history is not neat and linear. But there are people like Miguel Enriquez that really force us to grapple with the complexities of the colonial past.
Yeah, and now jumping ahead a little bit, I was wondering if you could tell us how the Haitian Revolution in 1791 affected how people viewed Puerto Rico.
Absolutely. For me, the Haitian Revolution is perhaps one of the most important events in the history of the Americas. There are scholars that argue that when we think about rights, oftentimes we think about the French Revolution and we think about the US Revolution. And this is historian Laurent Dubois' argument, and I agree with him. When we think about human rights, we need to center the Haitian Revolution. Here we have what anthropologist Michel Trujillo used to call an unthinkable revolution. It is a revolution that was created by people that were not considered human, by formerly enslaved people that not only were able to topple the government in Saint-Domingue, later becoming Haiti in 1804, but also created one of the most advanced constitutions the world had ever known till then. They were also not only demanding human rights, they were also claiming their humanity. And so it was a world-shattering event. And so in Puerto Rico, the authorities feared Haiti greatly. So in the book, I talk about the ghost of Haiti and how it haunted colonial elites, because they feared Haiti for two reasons. First, they feared the French Revolution and they feared the US Revolution because of its discourse of anti-monarchical sentiments, because these both were liberal, modern, enlightened revolution. And so the Haitian Revolution was all of that, plus it was created by Black formerly enslaved peoples. And so the government in Puerto Rico was really heightened and in alert when it happened. And so one of the things that I document in the book is that immediately after Haiti becomes a country in 1804, we can see the amount of enslaved revolts grow in Puerto Rico. This is also the moment that historians call the second slavery. It's the moment in which the British are basically trying to control the slave trade. But we see that the number of enslaved peoples in Puerto Rico and in Cuba, the last two colonial enclaves in the Americas of the Spanish Empire, continue to grow exponentially. And so for me, it's important because the Haitian Revolution happens in 1791. And so after that, in 1804 onwards until the late 1820s, you have a series of revolutions in the Spanish Americas. And so it's this moment of revolutionary fervor. The winds of revolution are blowing throughout the Americas and the Caribbean. And so you have that the Spanish government is seeking to control its last two colonial possessions that are Cuba and Puerto Rico. And so they fear not only independence, but they fear enslaved uprisings. And they fear all of this talks of revolution. In fact, after the French Revolution, all of the articles that came from French were prohibited in Puerto Rico. Any talk of equality, of liberty and freedom was suppressed in Puerto Rico, precisely because of that fear, not only of France, but also of Haiti.
Yeah, another document that I was really interested in, if you could tell us about, was the 10 Commandments of Free Men. If you could tell us about that.
Yes, absolutely. So that is also part of that moment, right? So I tell my students that when we think about El Grito de Lares, which is this insurrection that happened in Puerto Rico in 1868, on September 23rd, 1868, we need to think of it in the context of all of these revolutions, the American Revolution, the French Revolution, the Haitian Revolution, all of the revolutions that were happening in Spanish America. And so here we have a group of revolutionaries that began organizing an insurrection to advocate for Puerto Rico's independence in 1868. This was led by a medical doctor that was educated, African descent medical doctor from Mayagüez, Puerto Rico, who was educated in France, and he starts organizing in New York, in Haiti, in the Lesser Antilles for the independence of Puerto Rico. And he writes the 10 Commandments of Free Men. And as you were mentioning, I think that's a great document for teachers and students to think about how in Puerto Rico, these ideas that led to the French Revolution, that led to the American Revolution and to the Haitian Revolution were also being discussed in Puerto Rico. And it led to a revolution that was curtailed by the Spanish government. It lasted at least about 48 hours. There was 48 hours of fighting before it was suppressed. So I like to mention to my students that Puerto Rico is a republic for about 48 hours. Although there were some people that continued fighting for a couple of months. This is also the moment in which the Cubans are fighting for their independence. So in the span of about a week after El Grito de Lares in Puerto Rico, a week or two, in Cuba, you have El Grito de Yara that leads to 3 decades of fighting until they get their independence in 1898. In Puerto Rico, it did not lead to independence. But in the book, one of the things that I mentioned is that for the revolutionaries at Lares in this 1868 insurrection, the nation was already a reality. They just needed the political apparatus. And so that's what they were fighting for. And so for me, it's also a clear example of how in the 19th century, the idea of the nation, even though it was a Spanish colony, was already there. And for people like Betances, the same person that wrote these commandments, he used to say, well, the nation is already there. And we deserve to be free in these ways. But ultimately, I think that those 10 commandments are a liberal manifesto, really influenced by the revolutionary currents in the US, in France, and in Haiti.
And now in that timeline, can you tell us what the shift from the Spanish to American rule at the turn of the 20th century looked like?
Yeah, it's a vastly complicated moment, but I think it's a fascinating moment as well. Just to summarize it very quickly, in 1868, you have this revolutionary fervor in Puerto Rico, that insurrection that gets squashed by the Spanish government. And afterwards, you see that in the next 3 decades, there are people that are claiming for more autonomy within the Spanish orbit. And so there's this moment in which there's a group of politicians that go from Puerto Rico to Spain to negotiate more autonomy. And one of the leaders there, Praxedes Sagasta, actually strikes a deal. And he says, if I am prime minister, I will grant Puerto Rico its autonomy. Somewhat unrelated, Ramón Emeterio Betances, the same individual that organized El Grito de Lares in 1868, met with this anarchist that was asking for money to kill the Spanish king or a member of the royal family. Betances said, no, don't do that. The person that is really the mastermind is the prime minister. All of this to say that an anarchist assassinates the prime minister, creating a political vacuum in Spain. And so the prime minister that had agreed to give Puerto Rico its autonomy becomes the prime minister, and he grants Puerto Rico its autonomy in 1898. But the drums of war were already heard throughout. You could already hear the drums of war in the Caribbean. And so Puerto Rico becomes an autonomous government, an autonomous country of the Spanish Empire in 1898. But shortly after, on April 12th, General Sampson attacks the US. General Sampson attacks the city of San Juan. A few months later, on July 25th, 1898, in the context of the War of 1898, colloquially known as the Spanish-American War, and colloquially taught as a splendid little war in textbooks, basically changed the course of Puerto Rican history. So Puerto Rico was occupied on July 25th, 1898, and it was ruled through a military government for the following 2 years. So Puerto Rico was a military government, had a military government from 1898 to May 1st, 1900, when the U.S. Congress, the U.S. Senate passed the Foraker Act, which created a somewhat democratic government in Puerto Rico. However, it's interesting to me that from 1900 to 1917, Puerto Ricans were in a legal limbo in the international community because the Foraker Act granted us Puerto Rican citizenship that was not recognized in any international organ. And so it's not until 1917, in the context of World War I, when the United States is entering World War I, and after years of lobbying from different sectors in Puerto Rico, that the United States passes the Jones-Chaffetz Act of 1917 that grants Puerto Ricans U.S. citizenship. And so this is, I think, a very important moment because a lot of people in the United States oftentimes are confused as to Puerto Rico's relationship to the United States. And so we are U.S. citizens since 1917, after the passing of the Jones-Chaffetz Act. It's also important to mention that it's not only a change of polity after 1898, but there were also a series of Supreme Court cases from 1901 to 1921 that are still the rule of the law in terms of Puerto Rico's relationship to the United States. And so this insular cases basically established that Puerto Rico belongs to, but is not part of the United States, and that the U.S. Constitution does not follow the U.S. flag. And I know I'm extending, but the last thing I'll say about that is that I am currently physically in Puerto Rico, and so I'm not currently fully protected by the U.S. Constitution's Bill of Rights. As soon as I jump on a plane and land in Madison, Wisconsin, I am fully protected by the U.S. Constitution of the Bill of Rights. And so this is part of the legacy of these insular cases that took place in the early 20th century.
Yeah, and just our chat is blowing up, but I just wanted to circle back to something you mentioned earlier about the Supreme Court insular cases, because I think that's so important to your story. If you could share that with us.
Absolutely. So these insular cases happened from 1901 to 1921. And so they basically dictated the relationship between Puerto Rico and the United States. As I mentioned, one of them stated early on that Puerto Rico belongs to, but it's not part of the United States, that Puerto Rico is an unincorporated territory of the United States. So basically what was happening is that the United States was trying to legally understand how to treat Puerto Ricans in the mainland and in the archipelago itself. There's a wonderful book by a colleague and friend, Monica Jimenez, Making Never Neverland, in which she talks about the racial dimensions of these cases, because the justices that decided the insular cases were, some of them were the same justices that decided Plessy v. Ferguson and segregated the U.S. South. So when we read the actual Supreme Court cases and the opinions that were created in those cases, they're full of racist, xenophobic understandings of Puerto Ricans as too savage, too backward, et cetera, et cetera. And so for me, the interesting and complicated and problematic thing is that those cases are still the rule of the law of the land in the 21st century. In fact, a few years ago in 2016 and 2017, there were two other Supreme Court cases that some scholars say that are the new insular cases that basically ratify the insular cases of early 20th century. And so for me, it's interesting and important to talk about this in the book because it highlights the presence of the past, particularly when we think about the relationship between Puerto Rico and the United States. And I know that I'm jumping ahead. Puerto Rico became a commonwealth of the United States in 1952. We actually drafted our own constitution. It's a highly complicated process. I won't go into the details. However, these cases still basically document the colonial dimension of Puerto Rico's relationship to the United States, regardless of our Commonwealth status.
Yeah, there's so much chock full of good, great stuff for teachers to use in the classroom, but I feel like this case, especially for teachers doing 20th century stuff, they might not cover, and your book beautifully illustrates that. So,
Thank you. Yes, and I think it's a wonderful sort of case study because it's not only about Puerto Rico, the insular. I only focus on Puerto Rico in the book, but the insular cases were about all of the territories that the U.S. acquired after 1898. So you have case studies for Guam, for the Philippines, for Puerto Rico, and so it's very rich to use as a tool in the classroom.
yeah, I could just talk to you forever. But on that note, I'm going to pass you over to Ryan, who's going to do our student scholar question of the week.
Absolutely.
Yeah, thanks so much, Sheena, for that amazing back and forth. It was great to listen to, and really happy to get into this portion of the program. Just as a reminder for folks who might be new, we always start off this section with our History Scholar question of the week, and this is a weekly competition in which students from across the country and world have an opportunity to submit a question, and the winning question, that student will not only have their question read aloud on air, but also receive a $50 gift card to the Gilder Lehrman Institute of American History gift shop for themselves and their teacher. And this week, our winner is Milo. And the question is this: how did Hurricane Maria impact the relationship between the U.S. and Puerto Rico, specifically within the debate over statehood versus independence?
That's a great question, Milo. Thank you for that. I really appreciate it. I think that there's a before and after Hurricane Maria. Maria became a turning point. In fact, I was talking to someone the other day, to a colleague, and I was telling them that, Puerto Rico has not recovered from Maria fully. You can still feel it in its infrastructure, in the way, even in the lack of power in certain places, the lack of lighting. But to your particular question, I think that Hurricane Maria is central and essential in many ways. The first way is that it reconfigured the relationship between the Puerto Rican diaspora and Puerto Ricans in the archipelago, because a lot of Puerto Ricans in the archipelago felt that they could not trust their government, neither locally nor federally, after Hurricane Maria. I won't go into the details of the politics, but a former president that arrived to Puerto Rico during Hurricane Maria did some really problematic things that got people talking about what is the role of the federal government in the aftermath of Maria. And so I think that in terms of the political landscape, it reconfigured the political landscape. Shortly after Hurricane Maria, which was on September 19th and 20th of 2017, you have a massive protest across the archipelago. And so in 2019, in the heels of the pandemic and the lockdown, you have that in this summer of 2019, the people of Puerto Rico took the streets after a telegram chat between the governor of Puerto Rico and his inner circle was leaked, and basically for weeks protested until the governor resigned and the governor was ousted. For me, that is the aftermath of Hurricane Maria. Part of the reason why people were mad, it's because of the way that the local government handled the situation in Maria. And not only that, when they read in the telegram chat transcript that the governor was making fun of the people that died, people were enraged. And so I think that that's a direct sort of relationship between Hurricane Maria and the political panorama. Another thing that's important to note is that when the president of the United States was here, the official death toll was 16, 17, or 18 people. People knew that it was larger than that. And eventually a study between Harvard University and La Universidad Carlos Albizu in Puerto Rico basically stated that more than 4,645 people died as a consequence of Hurricane Maria. And so for a lot of people, that was unacceptable. And so they felt that neither the local nor the federal government acted the way it should have in a situation like Hurricane Maria. And so it really marked the tone of the conversation. So now, for example, I think that what we're seeing, and we have a very important election in November in the United States, but also in Puerto Rico, the election is highly important for our contemporary history, because there's the possibility of breaking with the bipartisan system of the two parties that have alternated power since the 1940s in Puerto Rico. And I think it's precisely as a consequence of Hurricane Maria, the 2019 protests, that a new party has emerged saying, let's not talk about the political status for a second. Let's talk about the current economic, fiscal, social situation in the archipelago, and let's fix that. And that's being led by a pro-independence party, which since the 1950s is the first time that the pro-independence party has the possibility and a real chance in winning at the ballot box. Now, all of that, I think, is a direct result of Hurricane Maria and the way that the local and federal government responded to the situation. So I think that was a great question.
Mhm. Thank you, Milo.
Thank you, Milo. There's a whole chapter in the book about Hurricane Maria, chapter 13, which was the most difficult chapter for me to write. But I think it's very, it addresses some of the things that your question beautifully and wonderfully collected.
Awesome. As Gina says, we have so many questions. I'll do my best to get to as many as possible. Deborah asks if there's any, if there were any ever any physical signs of racial segregation in Puerto Rico, like we may have, like by we I mean Americans might have seen in Jim Crow South. Have those existed?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I didn't get a chance to talk about this, but in the book, I do go deep into the ways that the Spanish colonial system was highly stratified in relation to race. And so I think that white supremacy also operated in Puerto Rico differently, but it still operated. And unlike the United States, one of the things that happens, and this is why I think that in the case of Puerto Rico, there's more comparison with cases like Brazil or other places in Latin America. In Puerto Rico, there was a racial democracy myth that was articulated in the 19th century. And it was this idea, in the book, I call it the Great Puerto Rican Family myth. And this is a trope. This is not my idea. I'm building on the work of many scholars that have identified this. But what happens is that this trope of color blindness, we're all the same, what basically was erasing was the racial segregation that was very real. And in the 19th century, particularly during the time of enslavement, in Puerto Rico, slavery is abolished in 1873. Before that, there was something called El Bando de la Raza Negra, which was this legal decree in which if an African descent person, either free or enslaved, did something, the punishment was 3 times harsher than a non-Black individual. So absolutely was deeply stratified racially. Gender was also, there was gender hierarchies as well in Puerto Rico, and they continue through the 20th century and the 21st century. And I think that now in Puerto Rico, there's a broader conversation about the role of Blackness and the ways that, although we don't talk about it, race mediates social relations and structures in Puerto Rico. So absolutely, we did not have laws like in the United States, like the Jim Crow South, or what some scholars call the Juan Crow, which is the Latinx sort of set of laws that dictated, the racial elements. But we did have racial stratification in Puerto Rico, and I document that in the book, particularly in the 19th century.
Wow, fascinating. Thank you so much for that great question and answer. Sam in our chat is wondering if you could talk a little bit about how cities in the United States, such as Miami, New York, Chicago, Hartford, have been shaped by Puerto Rican immigration, and vice versa, how Puerto Rico has been shaped by that immigration as well.
Absolutely. Part of the argument in the book is that we need to think about the Puerto Rican diaspora as part of that Puerto Rican nation. I mentioned at the beginning that Puerto Rico is a nation that is diasporic, fluid, and legally ambiguous. And so one of the things that I wanted to do was to incorporate the diaspora in the book. I like to joke that parts of New York, Miami, Kissimmee are neighborhoods of Puerto Rico, son barrios, extensions of Puerto Rico, because you have such a thriving historical community. So yes, they've been shaped. Puerto Ricans are shaping the political landscape. And I think that Puerto Ricans are also challenging this idea in terms of electoral politics of the Latinx vote as homogenous. And so it's also documenting the porosity of Latinx communities. Puerto Ricans are shaping these urban enclaves, but I think most importantly, one of the things that we're trying to push from UW-Madison is this idea that we need to be attentive to the new patterns of migration. So now, although the traditional historical migrations were to like enclaves in New York, Hartford, Philly, places in Florida, we're now seeing groups of Puerto Ricans across the United States in rural spaces. And that is why, for example, reggaeton artists have been crucial in this presidential campaign, where you see reggaeton artists that are unknown for the average American people, but it's because political campaigns understand the importance of the Puerto Rican vote, particularly in places like Pennsylvania, which is a contested state. And so I think that, yes, absolutely. And we've also, and this ties to Milo's question about Hurricane Maria. After Hurricane Maria, we're seeing that a lot of Puerto Ricans are coming back to the archipelago. And so those people that had left and that had spent years in the US are also reshaping local relationships in Puerto Rico itself.
Wow, fascinating. Adam in our chat asks what are some common misconceptions that Americans have about Puerto Rican history? And as a part two, how can teachers integrate Puerto Rican history into their lesson plans about American history? And I'll just say, I know based on how many questions we have in the chat and how many folks registered, great deal of interest in this book. And, there's so many teachers on the call right now. So feel free to, many would love to integrate your specific work into their class planning as well. So feel free to, if you can, tell us how they can use your work as well in the classroom.
Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you so much for the question. In terms of the misconceptions, I think that there's a friend and scholar, Mónica Jimenez, who argues that Puerto Rico oscillates between invisibility and then hypervisibility without agency, because I think that we became hypervisible after Hurricane Maria, but it was all through the lens of we need to help the US citizens in Puerto Rico. And oftentimes, although that came from a good place, it erased the agency of Puerto Ricans. And so in terms of the misconceptions, a lot of people don't really understand Puerto Rico's relationship to the United States. Here you have an archipelago with a main island with about 3 million Puerto Ricans that are US citizens, yet they cannot vote in the presidential elections. Puerto Rico is very important when it comes to presidential candidates and when they're campaigning, because Puerto Ricans can vote they can send delegates to the National Convention to elect a candidate, but they cannot vote in the presidential elections. And so there's a lot of misconception around that. When I first arrived in the United States to do my PhD in 2013, I was speaking Spanish to my daughter at a Walmart, and a gentleman approached me and said, "Speak English, you're in America." And so I tried to strike a conversation with him to tell him about, the relationship between Puerto Rico and the United States, the colonial dimensions of it, also how Puerto Ricans are US citizens. And so I think there's a great need to understand Puerto Rico. Also, the current political moment is very complicated and difficult to understand. And I think that history allows us to understand why Puerto Rico has the high debt that it has, why Puerto Rico has a fiscal oversight board that has more power than the executive and the legislative branch in the archipelago. And so all of those things, I think that history can really help us understand. But to the second question, which, as I was a high school teacher myself, I taught Puerto Rican history, I taught US history, and in the US history classes that I taught here in Puerto Rico, in a prep school, in a prep high school, Puerto Rico only entered the narrative as a single sentence in the unit on the Spanish-American War. And so I think that Puerto Rico can really help us understand post-1898 United States. It can really help us understand those debates that happen within the United States and its political sphere around empire, around imperialism, about overseas territories. It can help us think about the insular cases, can help us think about the reach of the United States globally from a legal perspective. It could also really allow us to complicate the messy racial history of the United States, that it's not only the Jim Crow South and the afterlives of slavery, but also how those logics were reproduced in places like Puerto Rico. I am currently writing a book or starting to write a book on the role of universities during the Spanish-American War in justifying the war, and particularly because I found a lot of university students enrolling to go and fight, not only in Cuba, because we have the history of Roosevelt and the Rough Riders, but also in Puerto Rico and the Philippines. So I think that Puerto Rico can really help us yield light on what Daniel Immerwahr called, in his book, How to Hide an Empire. It could really allow us to see that sort of imperial history of the United States and how it's so relevant today as we speak, at a moment in which both major parties in the United States, both the Republican and the Democratic Party, drop statehood as an option in their party's platforms. So what does that mean? So I think that it really allows us to comprehend the intimacy of empire in broader U.S. history, and I'm happy that that the book has been received the way it has, because when I wrote it in a way that it was accessible for students to understand this complicated history. And I think that Puerto Rican history is not only a history of the Caribbean and Latin America, but it's also U.S. history as well.
Wow, fascinating. And it's back to school time, or the semester is just starting. So this is a great time to get your hands on this awesome book, and we encourage everyone to do so. Professor, you mentioned just a moment ago something that several folks in our chat have asked about. And I'll try to combine questions just in the interest of time. Like, if you could talk a little bit about the divergence or the differences, the trajectory of colonialization when thinking about Puerto Rico and Cuba and the Philippines. Like, how did those histories kind of diverge, or any similarities, overlap? Huge question, but if you wouldn't mind enlightening us.
No, that's absolutely great, because I think it really highlights the importance of the previous question of how do we teach these things, right? And how do we teach the War of 1898 as going beyond the rhetoric of a splendid little war. It was something that lasted a few months. We did it. We acquired all of this, but it allows us to also comprehend the complexities of an event such as the War of 1898. And in terms of, that's a great question, because it allows us to think about, divergent sort of histories, but the ways that they're connected. So 1898, the United States invades Cuba, it invades Puerto Rico. It's also fighting in the Philippines. And so after the war ends on December of 1898, they signed the Treaty of Paris. Through the Treaty of Paris, Puerto Rico becomes a colonial possession of the United States, Guam as well. And so also the Philippines, Cuba is granted independence, it becomes a protectorate, and later on it establishes the First Republic. But the thing is that in the Philippines, people continued fighting for almost half a century until they get their independence. In the case of Cuba, we see the ways that they created a protectorate, then the first republic in Cuba. However, one of the things that I like to tell my students, I have a full class, a seminar, an undergraduate seminar on the War of 1898. And so one of the things that I tell my students is that the Cuban revolutionary fighters were winning the war when the United States intervened. They knew that it was a matter of months until Spain surrendered. And so because of the US intervention, they created a protectorate, and later on, they basically used Cuba as a satellite. And so there's all this problematic history there, but unlike Cuba, the Philippines, or Guam, Puerto Rico became a colonial possession. It was this unincorporated territory of the United States. And so we see that 1898 meant different things for different people. For Cuba, it was the start of their Republican model. And we need to also talk about, we don't have time, but I think that in a classroom, it allows us to also talk about US interventions in the region, the way that it intervened with the US Marines in Cuba multiple times. The Philippines continued fighting for their independence. And in Puerto Rico, it laid the foundations of US colonialism. And I talk about it in the book with the establishment of the University of Puerto Rico, the way that the educational system was modeled after the Massachusetts pedagogical model, et cetera, et cetera. So yes, so it's I think 1898, it's such a rich moment to understand the ways that the histories of the Caribbean, the Pacific, the Europe, the Atlantic world were all connected with US history as well. So I guess that in a way, it allows us to see the global dimensions of US history.
Wow, fascinating. Also, the perhaps apex of the eugenics movement as well, which is very important, I think. Overwhelmingly, and just in keeping time in mind, overwhelmingly, I think the most questions have are trending towards the question of statehood. If you could just talk a little bit about like what have been some of the historic like debates for and against statehood by Puerto Ricans? You know, what have those conversations and debates within the island looked like?
Yes, absolutely. So I think that's a very important question, and one that is very relevant right now in Puerto Rico as we look towards November and another election cycle here in Puerto Rico. So statehood is a vastly complicated issue, and independence, the political status of Puerto Rico writ large. But I'll have to say that when thinking about statehood historically, it's important that there was an elite class in Puerto Rico after 1898 that thought that the US occupation meant that we were going to be incorporated into the Union. Part of the interesting thing, and it goes back to 1898, is that until then, the United States had only acquired territories that were on its pathway to statehood. With the insular cases, what the United States did by declaring that Puerto Rico was an unincorporated territory, that it belonged, but it was not part of the United States, was that it broke away with its own legal tradition of incorporating territories on the path towards statehood. Now, that's also racially coded, racially understood, but for people in Puerto Rico, a lot of them thought that the occupation was going to bring statehood. Then in 1917, with the passing of the Jones Law that made Puerto Rican citizens, another group thought, well, this is the next step is statehood. That did not happen. Part of the reason is racial. This idea that Puerto Ricans cannot govern themselves was very adamant at the turn of the 20th century, and I think that's still the case in some parts. Puerto Ricans, when they crafted their own constitution and they created the Commonwealth in 1952, this was with the backdrop of the decolonization movement in the global South. You have the decolonization of countries in Africa and Asia, and so the U.S. used this moment to say we don't have a colony at the United Nations. So that way they didn't to submit a report on colonial possessions in regards to Puerto Rico. But all this to say that statehood was not really something that was closed throughout the 20th century. In fact, in the 1930s, after some nationalists killed the chief of police, Officer Riggs, Puerto Rico was closer to being independent than being a state. There were multiple bills that were passed in Congress or that were discussed, never passed, that were discussed in Congress about Puerto Rican independence. And so the pro-statehood party emerged in the mid-20th century, and it has won the ballot box multiple times in Puerto Rico, about 6 to 7 times, and statehood has not arrived. Now, also, we've had multiple referendums that are non-binding, where the people of Puerto Rico have decided on the majority of them that they want to stay a commonwealth. Most recently, in the last referendums that we've had, in these assemblies, Puerto Ricans have voted for statehood. So statehood has won the vote. But what we need to look at is the majority of people that are of elective age did not participate in the process. So while we see that statehood won, we see that participation dwindled. And so it's a vastly complicated thing, and more so because, as I mentioned, the Republican Party was very explicit in their 2016 party platform that they supported statehood. The same with the Democratic Party, and that was dropped in both of the parties' platforms in 2024, meaning that I think that statehood is farther than ever. Now, if we get into the nitty-gritty of it, part of it is also the number of representatives that Puerto Rico would offer because of its population density. We would have more representatives than 25 or 26 states of the Union. We would have 2 senators as well. And so this is also a political conversation in Washington about what's at stake politically in incorporating Puerto Rico into the Union. And so it's a vastly complicated thing. Now, the Commonwealth Party, so traditionally Puerto Rican political parties do not operate in the same way that the US with Democratic and Republican. We operate on the basis of status, the pro-statehood party, the pro-Commonwealth, and the pro-independence. Now we have different parties, and there's an alliance between a movement called Victoria Ciudadana and the pro-independence party that have the possibility of winning the elections, or at least coming as runner-ups, which would be incredible given the electoral history of modern Puerto Rico. All that to say that it's a vastly complicated topic. I don't think that it will happen anytime soon. And it's very contentious as well, because it mediates electoral politics in Puerto Rico. But I think that the only reason why there's a possibility that the pro-independence party wins, or at least becomes a runner-up in November, is because people understand that a victory of the pro-independence party, the same way that the pro-statehood party has been winning since the 60s, does not mean that independence will arrive. But they're just interested in sort of the political discourse of the pro-independence party in terms of more liberal reforms.
Wow. Well, this has just been so fascinating. We had honestly a near record amount of questions, so many more than we had time for. So I would say before I throw it back to Gina for some final thoughts and a look ahead to next week, just please get your hands on this book. It's really the best way to and have all of your questions answered. And we'll have to have you back very soon, Professor, or perhaps a self-paced course or something might be in store, because we had a lot of interest. Gina, back to you.
Yes, absolutely. And if you want to purchase the book right now at bookshop.org, the affiliate commission we receive supports our programming for history teachers and students. And we hope you'll join us next Sunday when we welcome Dr. Lindsay Travinsky and her book, Making the Presidency, John Adam and the Precedents That Forged the Republic. And you can go online and explore our archive of more than 225 scholar and presentations, as well as documents, essays, digital exhibitions, and the Hamilton Education Program at gilderlearman.org. Thank you again, Professor, for joining us today. It was truly an honor to have you here.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Ryan. Thank you, Gina. And thank you for the questions to the audience.
All right, have a great day, everyone.